Hello, everyone. I'm Corbett Crutchley. We're going to be talking today with Brad Garropy, the host of WebDev Weekly. He's worked for Fortune 500s and done all sorts of awesome stuff. We'll keep it light and breezy and engage in some questions from chat. So please feel free to ask anything that comes in your mind. Brad, how you doing?
Doing good. That's a really great introduction. A lot of times when I think about my own career, I don't say Fortune 500 companies and this and that. I just go, I stay busy, you know?
Yeah, and I think it's so hard to like easily pitch yourself. Especially in like professional environments. I work with a lot of people on their resumes and stuff, and it's like, what do I put down? Like I type on a computer for 12 hours a day. Like what does that even equate to, you know?
I swear, like Wes Boss said it really well today. He's like, Wordle? Like, that's what I do all day. I make little things for the internet. And he's like, this guy just came along and showed everybody what we do. We don't just play on the computer. We play on the
Right.
computer with a purpose.
Exactly. I remember one of my old coworkers had said something like pretty similar. It's like, oh, I used to just like hack on these little tiny games on like Cityscapes or like whatever the old websites from the '90s were. Um, Always like I was a little past that trend, but I remember like the Neopets and like MySpace and
Yeah.
oh yeah,
Mhm.
everyone has to start somewhere. Speaking of, where let's hear a bit about yourself. There's always someone behind the screen, right? So like, where'd you get your start? How did you tell us your story?
Yeah, I was not one of those, younger kids who was into programming. I was just
Hmm.
like into video games and I used computers like everybody else. Like you said, the MySpace, the this and that. I
Right.
did like try to make a website for my high school's drumline, a drumline I was a part of.
Oh, that's cool.
It was basic HTML and stuff. But really, when I went to college, I was like, I want to do something here that is worth paying for. I
Right.
want to utilize the labs and the things like that. So I went to the University of Texas. I got a degree in electrical engineering. There was some programming involved, like two courses, but that's what interested me.
Hmm.
So I joined Dell, spent a lot of time there, like 10 years doing
Nice.
low level like firmware development in C.
Hmm.
Ran away from that kind of as fast as I could, like just because like I realized like I want to start working my way up the language stack. Uh, got my first kind of big break at Adobe after teaching myself web development, and
Hmm.
Adobe, rolled the dice on me because I really built up a portfolio and worked hard on that to kind of show that I was capable. Spent a couple years there working on Magento and Adobe Commerce, and then just made the jump over to Atlassian recently, working on Trello, so a product that probably a lot of people have touched.
Yes. Oh man, I love Trello. I can't tell you how many times I've like opened up Jira for like a new project, and then I'm like, no. And then I just open up Trello and I'm like, there we go. That's more my speed.
Yeah, it's got like the whimsy in there that Jira doesn't have. The
Yeah.
confetti when you complete something and things like that. It just feels a little more personable.
Well, and especially for like, when I work on side projects, they're usually like me and maybe like one or two other friends, right? Like, I just don't even know what multiple assigners would even do for me,
Yeah.
definitely having that simplicity is a huge boon when you're working in small or even medium-sized teams. There's something to be said about simplicity in general.
Yeah.
Very cool. I actually didn't even know that you had gotten your start working with Dell.
Yeah, it's been a
What?
long time there. I'm like,
Yeah.
down the street from it, was going into the office in Round Rock, Texas, is their headquarters. So,
Mhm.
yeah, they do a lot of stuff out of that building. There's a lot of hardware in there too. Tons of
Oh yeah.
servers. We needed direct access to them. So, it was a different world than web development that I'm involved in now.
I can only imagine the number of like memory errors that you've ran into have probably gone down. I'm assuming like web dev, you don't tend to run into those unless if you've made a really bad like for loop, a really bad for loop. But I can only imagine when you're dealing with like assembly or C or like any of those languages, it's like, oh hey, I have a memory leak somewhere. That's neat.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
I think one of my favorite stories about memory leaks, total tangent, but there's this story about a rocket manufacturer, and I don't think it's actually true, but it's like the joke of like, hey boss, we have a memory leak in our rocket like controller, and it's like, why do we have this extra memory when we could just solve the memory leak? And he's like, no. Here's the deal. It's cheaper and easier to add more memory because eventually the rocket's going to hit its target, and then we don't have to ever worry about memory cleanup ever again.
Hey, there you go. There you go.
Unfortunately, most computers don't have this exit strategy.
The biggest challenge we had was like when things catastrophically broke, you needed a way to get like access to the systems, but you didn't want to walk into the lab. So I had this like elaborate serial connection that was connected to like a serial host. So you could remote into this serial host, choose what port you wanted to connect to, and then you got direct access, almost like you were physically plugged in to this bricked system, and you could do whatever you needed to do there. Beyond power cycling it, then we had to integrate remote power and like just to like restart these things when they totally got borked.
Yeah, it's like, hey, look, push the power button, and then the 10 feet cable.
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, so that's a little bit of your stack from then. What do you work with nowadays? I mean, web dev is such a huge field. You could be effectively saying, like is it mostly front end? And if so, like what framework? Like what have you been working in lately?
Yeah, I have always tended towards the front end. The visual aspect is what kind of got me into web development in general. The visible aspect and the ability to share it with anybody at any time, right? The internet. So
Right.
I've been tending towards the front end. I picked up on React pretty early and have stuck with it. I've just built a lot of tooling around it for myself and project templates and things like that. So I just move faster with it. But I've touched Vue, I've touched Svelte, I've touched Remix. At the end of the day, I think React is still like pretty core to front end development today, and all the companies I've worked at use it as well. And then definitely a big TypeScript fan. I was skeptical. I'm all in now. There's no going back. It's incredible. And really, I'm looking to expand my backend knowledge. I have the ability to write some node servers with like libraries like Express and Fastify. But I also want to make things easier on myself, and Supabase is just calling my name. You can get that app going that you want to like immediately. Like this user only has access to his data and such, and like Supabase just handles it so quickly out of the box.
Right. Well, and I remember so one of my early projects was working for a game developer company, a game development company, and I somehow stumbled upon my way into being the lead developer, and yet not knowing Unity or any of that whatsoever, right? And it was only because I knew how to scale databases. And I remember like one of our big concerns was like, oh man, Firebase is awesome. But then what do you do after you scale to a certain size, right? So it's super interesting seeing Supabase kind of come in and be like, hey, it's open source, look at that. Who knew? So it's super fascinating to see that ecosystem grow and evolve.
Yeah, and what's cool about Supabase too is like they're just relying on Postgres features, like row level security. That's how they're doing, authorization essentially. And so it's very portable. You're right. It's also open source. You can go host it wherever you want to, but they're just relying on features of a database. Whereas I think Firebase has a whole lot more around it. Plus, until recently, the JavaScript SDK was kind of a mess. I haven't actually checked out their new version 9, I think it is, that actually like made it modules and you only import what you need and things like that.
I remember that. That was a fun time. And then recently I've been trying I made like a template with like, React and TypeScript and Firebase.
Yeah.
And upgrading it from like version 5 to 9 was like pulling hair out of my head. It was like, this is ridiculous.
I've been like wanting to make like essentially just a to-do CRUD app as a template for like any application you ever want to build. And the last time I attempted this was much earlier on in my career, and it was with Firebase. And I was like, this is hard. And I think I'm literally going to just delete it and start over and just kind of take everything I've learned since then and be like, I don't need to try to upgrade that code. Sometimes the nuclear option is the best option.
Well, and I think the cool part about a template is that like it's almost like a checklist for the things you need for your application, right? Like they
Yeah.
can be easy to forget the things of like great example. I know that you have some templates for like React libraries, right?
Yeah.
Because we'll talk about some of that in a second, but like uh, it's super interesting like getting linting set up, and then after you get linting it's like, okay, well, you need the specific linting rules for prettier, and then the specific linting rules for TypeScript and React hooks and this, like there's almost like a checklist that you have to go through for every application. And then for apps, right, like one of my favorite things to test with an application that like kind of someone newish of development or maybe just indie developer has done is what happens when I hit a 404, like an internal 404 page. What does it do? Does it redirect me? What happens when my cookie expires? Does it note it? Like, does it kick me back to login? If I'm on login, does it tell me why I'm on login?
Right.
Like there's so many edge cases to keep in mind. And I remember like one of the coolest demos I ever did really early in my career was when it redirected to a like an expired cookie, and then it kicked you back, but actually had a little modal that told you got kicked out. Wow.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Um,
And like I am religious about going back to those templates and keeping them up to date because I
oh
know
yeah.
that's where I stay grounded. Those have to be up to date. I cannot let them go stale.
I was gonna say because I follow you on GitHub, and I swear every week there's at least 7 or 8 new releases.
Yeah.
How do you maintain so many projects? Like, do you want to tell us about some of your open source libraries?
Yeah, I think at this point I've got like between 20 and 30, so it's manageable. I don't use the automated release tools that a lot of other folks use. I don't use what's it called? Semantic release, essentially.
Right, right,
Mostly because I'm very particular about things. And, in order to use an automated release and versioning system, you have to have commit messages that stick to a particular format.
right,
So
right.
that way, this tool can look at all your past commits and understand, is this a major, a minor, or a patch release? I want to customize all of those commit messages to be like specific to me. I don't want to use the pre-canned terminology. I'd rather make an emoji key. And I know there's Gitmoji out there. I would want to make my own. And so in order
Right.
to build this stack going from conventional commits and commit lint and semantic release, I would have to write custom configs all along the way to say use my standard. And I
Right.
was like, this is too much work. And I gave up on it. So of all these 30 packages, I'm, doing this by hand. But I've automated it to where I make a tag in GitHub. I manually enter in the version number. And so it's kind of like that's not the best thing in the world, but I kind of know what I did at least. And as
Yeah.
soon as that tag is published, I have an action that runs that moves it up to NPM. So that's kind of how I handle things. I'm still really looking for a good way to like manage to dos and priorities. I've got one of these books on this bookshelf that's going to get read very soon. It's called Getting Things Done because I need a system for this. It's not good right now.
It's so difficult when you're maintaining so many projects. It's like, oh man, I really want to work on this today, and then you remember, oh man, I should have worked. Like I should have done this other thing that was a
Yeah.
bigger priority. It's like, oh shoot, where did that go?
And I don't have a ton of like users. Most of all these packages really exist under my namespace in npm. They're mostly for me, but I market them because it's like, check it out. This benefited me. I made it for a reason. It makes something that was hard easier. So you should take a look at it too. But anytime a user comes in and logs an issue or gives some feedback, that is all of a sudden priority one. Like I want to make sure that gets addressed because it'll increase adoption.
Yeah, yeah, totally. So you mentioned earlier, like building up your portfolio for not Adobe, right? Was open source part of that portfolio?
Yeah, yeah. That was a really hard transition, right? I was a C firmware developer. Then I kind of moved into Python and DevOps and build management at Dell. And I was trying to make the jump to web development. So like it's kind of a different field, a different section of tech. And And actually, but my WebDev Weekly co-host kind of argued that point. He's like, programming is programming, no matter how you do it.
Oh yeah.
He is like one of those guys who like he wants to take a step back and be like, you can apply that knowledge anywhere. I
Yeah.
agree, but you really have to have a track record. I feel like, especially joining a company like Adobe that's so like web first, or I'd say web first. They do a lot of stuff online.
They do.
With the
Yeah.
company or with the product that I was working on, Magento, it's web first. So,
Right. Right.
anyways, a big part of that was like, how do I prove that I can do stuff? Okay, make my own website and make some projects and put it on that website and blog about it. Like that's the kind of proven way, in my opinion, to say like, I know I don't have any professional experience doing this, but I know what I'm talking about. And here is a living, breathing example that you can look at, with a URL. And that's
Right.
the beauty of like doing these web jobs. Just put up the work you've done. They are publicly accessible for the most part.
Right.
And it's like just a great show and tell.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I remember, so I went from a three-person startup to working at Hilton, which was like the hugest, like so weird because like the very first week at working for Hilton, they sent me to Minneapolis, and I'm like, I have not left California like
Yeah.
ever basically. So it was such a weird experience going from tiny to big company, and one of the ways that I did that was very similarly. I had a lot of open source. I One of the packages I maintained, Plop, I think just hit like 2 million a month, on npm, which is ridiculous, like mind bending. And it's just because I jumped in GitHub issues and was like, hi, thing broken, can I fix?
Yeah. Man, I love Plop. Like it saves so much time. It's VS Code snippets, which I leverage heavily and have
Right.
published packages for, but like
Mhm.
on steroids
Right.
because it's not just a single file that it's touching. It can do a whole lot of stuff, and there's a lot of templating options in there. Literally, you just hand it a template file and it just
Mhm.
does its thing. I love it. So I have packages for Plop out there as well that are very specific to my use cases too.
Right, right. Well, and that's how I started maintaining it, right? Is that like I was building out these templates. In fact, I was
Yeah,
building out the template that I was talking about, where,
yeah.
like the redirect flow and stuff. And I wanted to be able to customize it. So I used Plop, and sure enough, something didn't work because, it's software. So that's how I ended up working on it. And just one commit led to another, and then a feature pull request, and this and this, so it's been an interesting ride with open source, but it's done undeniable good for my career in general. Speaking of, what does that interview process look like? Like Dell and Adobe and Atlassian, I mean, these are big companies, right? Like there's a lot of powerhouses behind them. Like I can only imagine that the interview process must be fairly refined for these companies. Like what does that process look like?
Everyone was a little bit different. And even in my last job search, I applied for 60 jobs. I probably went on
Oh,
20 interviews. Like at this point, I've gone through a lot. But it changes in the different stages of your career. Like at Dell, I was coming out of college. I they had like a very tight relationship with the University of Texas because it's a local company, and so they were really plucking people off. That process was actually pretty easy to get into Dell just because of my location and the relationship between the university and the company. Adobe, I swear, was a stroke of luck. Like like I said, it was hard to prove myself, right? To say that like I know what I'm doing, but a lot of things worked in my favor. Number one, they were hiring for a greenfield team, so like this wasn't like come into this giant new project. They needed fresh blood, which was cool.
hmm
Number two, I was very like well read and up on the news of tech. I always listen to podcasts and read blog posts and things like that. And so when I walked into these interviews, I had a lot of like fresh takes, which they were eager to hear because it was a new project. If you're
Right.
walking into an old project and you're like, have you guys heard about this latest thing? They're going to roll their eyes and say, buddy, that's not how it works here, right? It
Yeah.
takes
Yeah.
time to migrate to this stuff. So
Yeah.
it was really like a right place, right time thing. I also got interviewed by a couple back end engineers for a front end position. And instead of grilling me with algorithms questions, they were like, tell me more about the front end and how you want to run an app. And like, because we weren't like, how do I say it? Like, we weren't in the same side of the stack, essentially. I was able to kind of say my visions, and they were like, that sounds good, you know?
Right, right.
So really, I think everything worked out to get me in the door there. After that, I gained a ton of credibility with the stuff I worked on and what I did inside the company. And then moving to Atlassian and all these rounds of interviews, I definitely approached them a little bit differently. Like, if I did get asked algorithm questions, I kind of gave a little pushback because I'm like, I'm shooting for senior engineering jobs. Can we talk about, I don't know, data loading patterns, or I don't know, like bundle management, or like
Right.
something else, you know, or your take on ESM versus CommonJS, or like
CJS.
things that kind of like are a little more at the forefront of what I should be thinking about.
Right. The things that actually matter to application development, you know, like
Yeah.
I totally agree. Like this concept of whiteboarding or algorithmic interviews, like I've written about it before, and like they just aren't what you're doing in an application. And even if you are, I mean, like, so I wrote an article called GitHub Copilot Breaks Bad Interviews. And the premise of it was like, hey, if you have an algorithm question that an AI can just boop, you're asking the wrong questions, right? Like,
Absolutely.
don't do that.
And I gotta say, like, I had Copilot turned on for all of my interviews,
Right.
and when people did let me use my own editor, I'm like, I'm not gonna feel sorry about this because this is a tool that I use.
Right. Right.
And in some cases, like, I was talking through my solutions, and before I could finish my sentence, I'd be like, yeah, that's what I was gonna do, you know, and that's just how it went. Yeah, I gotta say though, I actually uninstalled Copilot.
Really?
I found that the auto completions when they popped up distracted me too much. I like would spend more time thinking about what they were suggesting than finishing my thoughts. And
Yeah.
where it was most annoying was blog posts. I'm like trying to write a blog post and it is spitting out paragraphs, and I'm like, this is not my words, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. It's and you know, like I love the markdown editing process because of how minimal and clean it is, and then all of a
Right.
sudden it's like, wow, what if you do all of this? And it's like none of this is correct.
Yeah. And like, I understood I could like, you know, I could call it up with like a key binding or something, or I could disable it for certain file types. But at the end of the day, I'm like, I'm not learning how to code here. Like, I'm more established. I don't really need these nudges in the right direction. I just need to be able to think clearly and focus. And
Right.
if I need to ask a question, I won't ask Copilot. I'll go ask Google, you know. And
Right. Right.
I think at the end of the day, it was a distraction for me, and I felt a lot better ever since.
Good for you.
Yeah.
It's funny because like I almost wish, as ironic as this sounds, I almost wish Copilot had a single line mode where it just
Yeah.
wouldn't ever make a recommendation for multiple lines.
Yeah.
Because when it makes the one line recommendations, they're incredible. Like it's like, oh, it's gonna know exactly what variable you were gonna call before you even typed the character. It's like, great,
Yeah.
sweet. Now
And
stop
like,
recommending me 8 lines.
and you can also like tab through them one at a time, which is kind of nice. You're like, I like this line. Ooh, I want to change that approach. And then you start typing your version, and it's like, okay, it's like you're pair programming. You're kind of like completing each other's sentences instead of pile driving like the idea onto the page and not consulting the other person.
For sure.
Another thing
sorry,
that
go
like really bugged me about Copilot was I leverage like snippets, or even just like the auto completion of closing parentheses and brackets. And I don't know if you had this experience, but when I used Copilot and you were like accepting its recommendations, it would kind of take it verbatim as just that line. And if there wasn't a closing bracket there, it would be left hanging. And so like now you got to manually run down there and like fix that. That also
Right.
pulled me out of the flow.
Yeah, I feel that. I don't think I had so much of the issues, but you know, it's funny that we have so much like opinions on the topic. It sounds like you might have a video around the corner about like Copilot.
It's on my to-do list, and it's going to be real clickbaity title. It's
Yes.
why uninstalled GitHub Copilot, you know, like
Yes.
there you go.
It's awesome. I feel bad that I've spent so much time asking about, like, oh, your build up to your career, everything, when you have so much exciting stuff going on right now. Like, you host a WebDev Weekly podcast, which I would love to hear more about. But you also do a YouTube channel, which, like, I mean, the background behind you is just an example of, like, the awesome level of polish. Like, I know we've talked about it once or twice before, and it's like, oh, it's just lights, but it looks so good. It's so polished.
And the big key is it's not the lights back there, it's the one right here in front of me that makes the world of difference. I think proper lighting can like really change the mood too. Like it can be broad daylight out, and when I have this front light on, it looks like cozy like this, and people are like, "Why are you in a dark room?" And I'm like, "It's just an illusion, kind of."
You're like, I swear it's not as dark. It's like when I have my lights actually off, and it's like, Corbin, why are you in there? It's like the light of the computer keeps me warm.
Now, the question is, are you a dark mode or light mode kind of guy?
See, this is an unpopular opinion. I am a light mode kind of guy.
Me too.
Yeah.
Yep.
I don't know. Something about light mode helps me like stay more focused, and it makes me feel better, like emotionally. I don't know.
I think it perks you up. It wakes you up. Like
Yeah.
it's more contrasty to me as well. Like I always found that the contrast in light mode UIs is much better than the contrast in dark mode UIs.
Way better. Oh yeah. Because what ends up happening is that like dark modes will pick like a dark-ish blue, and then it's like, okay, but the range of colors that you have to like change now are all the way over here, like way way non-saturated, right?
Yeah.
So like your yellow looks exactly like your reds or whatever, just because there's no saturation involved because the
Sure.
contrast is gone. I think it's so funny always.
Unpopular opinion for sure.
Yeah. Oh yeah. But yeah, we talked about WebDev Weekly. You're up to how many episodes now?
We got to like, I want to say 30 something.
It's awesome.
I need to check on this, like to be honest.
And it was on. It's been such a relatively short period of time too. It feels like just cranking them out, which is awesome, like clockwork.
We were doing once a week, and so what happened, and this is kind of breaking news because I haven't actually announced anything. We haven't said anything. We took a break for the holidays, and then we both got new jobs, and we decided not to continue. So WebDev Weekly was a great experiment that lasted, how many episodes? 31 episodes, and it's sunsetting now. So
Gotcha.
sad day, but I learned a lot. It was my first podcast. Met Richard Gottlieb through Twitter, and like just invented this thing, gave birth to this thing, and like carried it through week by week it was like we were working on it for like almost 10 months, but then we were doing like I think it was like 6 or 7 months worth of content. We did a couple months of like pre-work of like branding and setting up accounts and all that stuff. So I learned a lot, and my biggest takeaway is like, should I make another one? Like, and there's a huge decision that goes into that of like, do you have a co-host? Do you do it solo? Do you do an interview style podcast? And there's pros and cons to all of it. But I have this like idea for my next one, and I just want to call it BG Codes, just like my Twitch channel and all that stuff. I kind of want to just make it a log of the things that I'm working on or the things that are on my mind, because like I appreciate podcasts like Shop Talk Show, where these guys just get on and kind of shoot the breeze about like, I encountered this problem today and it really got me thinking all week about the state of such and such in web development. And they like just go on this huge tangent where they're like, do you remember when it was easier? Do you remember when it was harder? Why is this so hard right now? And they like riff on topics. And like, I have this vision for myself. Like, it's one, holding me accountable to build the things I want to build, because it'll act as a little bit of a status report, but also to like give me a soapbox to stand on when I need one,
We all need one sometimes, let's be honest.
And the thing is, like, if you do a solo podcast, I don't know if people are going to get tired of listening to just me. Probably, let's be real. But like, there's no schedule conflicts. There's no, like, you just get in there, record, get out. Like, I think it does eliminate a lot of the barriers. And even with Shop Talk Show, they just hit 500 episodes, and Chris and Dave were like, every decision we made along the way was to make it easier to get this show out the door. We didn't do live recordings, with audiences and all this stuff because it was too hard. So like, you need to be consistent and you need to make the process easy. And
Right.
I think that's why I'm leaning towards like a solo project for the next one. If listeners won't think it's too boring, only having one point of view.
Well, and the nice part about doing solo stuff is that you can still have guests, right? Like,
Absolutely.
just because you're doing it solo doesn't mean you can't have other people join you. It just means that you don't have to, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's really cool. What you had mentioned some of the things that you'd heard from like Shop Talk podcast. What advice would you give to someone who's thinking about starting like a podcast or even a YouTube channel? Your YouTube channel is fairly successful as well, like what advice would you give to like a newcomer content creator?
Yeah. Okay. Gear doesn't matter, number one. And but it feels so good to get new gear. Like
It does.
It's progression, right? It's progression.
Right.
But like, I think the biggest piece of advice is like, start right now and talk about the problems that you're solving. If you thought something was hard and you got over it and you achieved it, somebody's having the exact same problem. And it does feel like regurgitation a little bit. But the thing is, like, people come across content through lots of different ways. Sometimes I use YouTube to search programming specific things because blog posts aren't giving me what I need, So like, if you can do that, if you can just put out there what you're solving the same problem for somebody else. I don't know.
And I think the other one that really struck a chord with me when I started like Twitch streaming and stuff, right, is like consistency can be king, right? It's like it's so difficult to get a cadence going. But even if it's like once a month, once every other week or whatever, like something to keep you going and like some type of deadline really can help motivate and drive like the type of work you're doing.
That is my single biggest struggle because if I do a blog and a YouTube channel and a podcast and a Twitch stream, what content goes where when? Right. And too often you're like, well, this will make a great blog article and a great YouTube video. And now you're doubling on content. And somewhere you have to draw the line between actually accomplishing something and then running the gamut of posting it everywhere. And I've struggled with that. It's because of that I'm not consistent in places. I've got this idea that's going to come out here soon of how to integrate Google Analytics 4 with Nxjs because I found that a lot of the articles I was reading were overly complex, honestly. And I made a component for it, a little package for it. And I'm like, well, this is a great blog post, but it's also a great video. What do I do?
Right.
And then you get in this analysis paralysis situation. And so at the end of the day, I'm like, I'm not even sure, maybe you just do YouTube and ignore everything else.
Right.
And you just go heads down on one. I gotta say Twitch has been the easiest for me to do though, because I don't prep anything. I just work live or learn live. And that's been the easiest thing to just flip the camera on when I'm accomplishing something. That's a no-brainer.
Well, I think the interesting part about Twitch though is that like I speak to a lot of like smaller time streamers and it's so difficult to get your footing in Twitch because like the discoverability is so much lower than alternatives, right? Like if you don't have an existing platform, I feel like Twitch is a very difficult place to get a foothold on, right? Because like blog posts, you have SEO, right, which drives a lot of like traffic and engagement, even if you don't write a ton. Likewise, blog or YouTube videos have some way of discovering, they have keywords or whatnot. But then it's like, oh man, Twitch, if you're not live and you're not live often, how are people going to see it?
Yeah. What's interesting about myself is that James Quick has said this, like Brad Garropy seems to be like everywhere, but he has like the least amount of followers that you could ever imagine. Like I don't have over 1,000 followers anywhere. And I don't care about those numbers. I'm doing this to like kind of build my reputation and career and, just my body of work. Right. But I will say with Twitch, I would go through periods of like, I am building a thing and it's a big thing. And so anytime I was accomplishing something, I was also streaming. So like there was a point where I developed a Svelte app and released it to the Google App Store. And I was streaming like every night because I was working on this thing. It's just like, just do your normal work, turn on the camera. And through that stretch of building that app was how I got to Twitch affiliate, whatever the first like level is.
Right.
And that took a while, but I feel like it was a fairly low bar. And in that case, consistency mattered a lot. And I was streaming like basically every night until I finished it for a period of like a few months.
Well, and I think that that's the beautiful part about Twitch is that like I usually use Twitch as like either one of two things, either helping other people with their code or like pair coding in some way, or it's focus time for Corbin. It's
Yeah.
like, all right, we got to get something done. I can't be on YouTube and I can't be doing this. We got to sit down and do our side projects, right? Because when you don't have deadlines, it's so difficult. But then, you know, you get Twitch chat coming in and there's a good conversation going. And it's always such an interesting time seeing what type of things happen on Twitch.
Yeah.
Such
For
a
the
cool
most part,
community.
Twitch is a focus enhancer for me, I will say. Like, unless chat gets rowdy, like you said, but you know, when you don't have a ton of followers, you know, you're just laser focused.
That's so true. You know, you'd mentioned not having a ton of followers, right? But the guests you were managed to secure for like WebDev Weekly were like astronomical, right? Like you had grade A guests, and like the conversations you had for a lot of them were like super interesting. How did you do that? Like, how did you get so many like incredible guests? Like, was it just asking, or like
We
what did that process look like?
we had Scott Talinsky queued up too before we called it quits as well. Like I mean, like
No.
I'm I network well. I don't know. I feel like I'm friends with a lot of these people, everybody I come across, and I think it just goes to show like if you're a genuine nice person who can ask good questions, respect other people's time, you know, but still like not be afraid to put yourself out there, you'll go far in relationships with other people. It doesn't mean you're going to have big numbers or things like that. It just means, you know, you're a nice person to chat with or whatnot, you know, and
And I
you
think
need to
that's
stay in touch.
right. And that's the coolest part is that like you and I have talked a fair few number of times between this, right? And I appreciate that whether we're on a camera or off camera, because there's been a few times where, you know, like, oh, Twitch stream ended and we're going to go hang out and chat for like 20-30 minutes just
Yeah.
shooting the stuff, you know? And I appreciate that most of the community work that I've done has been very authentic. Like you can actually have a conversation with people and go far just by being yourself, you know? It's really interesting to see how the community kind of comes together like that. Speaking of, one of the times that we kind of went back and forth quite a bit was with your blog rewrite, going from Gatsby to Nxjs. That was, I mean, for both of us, I did the same process as well. I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts about the two, and like you just came out with a blog post about it. What you know, what are your thoughts?
I'm like, at the end of the day, I was on the fence a lot, and I was like, stop thinking about it so much. Like you can be overly analytical. I should just go with my gut feeling, and my gut feeling was that Nxjs is the right choice. And here's the number one way I justify this. I believe that my site should always reflect my current technology choices. So even though Gatsby.js might be easier to get like a markdown blog up and running because of all their plugins and things like that, I'm a Nxt.js person right now. Like I'm going to use that to build applications, and it has a bigger scale than Gatsby has, and more flexibility. And so I'm like, well, if that's what I'm rubber stamping right now, then my website better be that. You know what I mean? You
Yeah.
can't say I'm an Nxt.js guy and have a Gatsby website on your home
It's
domain
anarchy.
name.
Yeah.
So that was like my number one way of saying I'm just gonna do it. But a lot went into it. Like there's just so much friction in Gatsby that I got tired of dealing with. The GraphQL data layer, while kind of cool, is also a big hindrance in a lot of ways. Like you're like, can't I just access this at runtime like an API? No, you can't. And I'm
Right.
like, they should totally do that, right? But also like when you're querying for data, now you have to make this like let's say one page, like the home page of my website has content from a lot of different places. Spotify, like not Spotify, YouTube and Captivate and all these different places. You'd write this GraphQL query that's very specific for that page. But on another page, let's say only a subset of those sources were used, you'd have to write a different GraphQL query. And so like every time I had to mock this out for testing, I was like mocking it out page by page by page because you couldn't just mock out like one data source at a time. You had to mock out this entire GraphQL query and the hook that it wrote in on. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I heard GraphQL and had to go, we're talking about
Yeah.
Gatsby and its GraphQL data layer.
Oh yeah. We both have some thoughts after migrating our sites from Gatsby to Nxjs.
Yeah, so I found it to be just an extra step that didn't need to be there. When I was doing the Nextjs data sourcing, they're like, read the file system, hit an API. We don't care. Hand us a JSON object.
Right. Right.
Gatsby was so different. You had to like create the GraphQL nodes because there's like a custom API for that, and it was just a lot, I think. And
Yeah.
it just made it easier mentally to work in Next.js. Although it still has its friction points. Like my site
Oh yeah.
still feels funny, in the local development environment. And the images loading, even on the main site, is still a little funny too.
Tricky. Yeah.
Gatsby got that one right really good. But overall, mental model, much simpler. And I appreciate that.
Well, and I think that that was the big thing for me is that like I was doing a ton of like custom programming for my site, right? And every time I was in Gatsby, it felt like I was writing Gatsby code, not like I was writing JavaScript or TypeScript or whatever language I was actually using. It felt very specific to what Gatsby was doing, and that has its benefits, right? Like GraphQL does have an immense, powerful API behind it. GraphQL absolutely has its time and its place, but it felt very off to me, right? Like things wouldn't work quite the way I wanted them to, and like it felt like if I was bending it, it would snap. And I felt like when I migrated to Next.js, everything was much more JavaScripty, right? Reading a file system, got it, use FS. And then you serialize to JSON, got it, JSON.stringify. Like there were things that you did that felt more normative in the ecosystem, right? Like I'm used to serialization with Redux. I'm used to, like a lot of these concepts felt very consistent with the rest of the ecosystem as opposed to very specific to Gatsby.
Yeah. And, going back to the GraphQL thing, GraphQL was invented to kind of solve this overfetching problem over the network.
Right.
Well, for Gatsby, you're writing GraphQL to make static data queries at build time. That seems to me like a little bit of an over engineering of that problem, right? You're not going to worry about overfetching because this is a static build time process where these GraphQL queries are getting executed. So why all the complexity?
Yeah, yeah, I feel that. One of the things you'd mentioned is that you're building some applications with Next.js, and so slight spoilers, but your website you have a goals post, which is an awesome read every year because it gives great insight into the things you're working on, what you're thinking about, and they're well written too, of course. One of the things on there is building some SaaS platforms. I'd love to hear like what your thoughts are on it. Yes, please link it. Thank you.
Yeah.
But I'd love to hear like your thoughts on what that process looks like. Like, how do you decide what to build? And then on top of that, like, where do you think you're going to go?
Let's see. I don't know if you want to entertain these chat questions. Viable is
I was
asking
gonna
some
say.
good ones.
Yeah.
Maybe we can pop back there and head back to the next stuff.
Yeah,
He
for sure.
asked,
I didn't see that until now.
they ask if I was using Next images. Yes, definitely. And that's something that Corbin and I collaborated on when I did not understand how to make that switch in Markdown on the client side. And he told me all about the magic of is it rehype React or React
Yeah, yeah,
rehype?
we
I don't
hype
know. I don't
React
know the ordering. Yeah.
for sure. And
But
that was a process
still,
and a half.
something about like the way that they do their blurring, uh, I need to revisit that. And I also feel like the loading on the images is very delayed on my website. Like I think if anything is under the fold, they like deprioritize them until it scrolls into view, and so that's like feels kind of janky in some situations. So I just have to kind of look at my like how the page paints and just make that a little bit nicer. And then Viable was saying, any thoughts on Next SSR versus static export? I've got essentially a static blog website that I have no reason to SSR anything. And actually,
Right.
as I was doing this rewrite, I kept thinking to myself, why do I have JavaScript and rehydration? Should I just be using Astro or 11D for this? Because like, holy
Yeah.
cow, 800K for like a static blog's homepage? And I'm like kind of just shaking my head at myself going, this is a little over engineered for sure.
Well, and one of the interesting things is that, like, so I had a pretty big homepage for a while. But one of the things that actually helped me reduce that homepage size was building my own, almost like an alternative to GraphQL using JavaScript and TypeScript, right? So what I would do is I would have like an object that I would pick from and then only pass down those keys. Because what ends up happening is that whether you use the data or not, whatever you serialize through Nxjs in the get static exports or whatever
Goes over
gets
the
sent to
wire.
the client.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
And that's such a difficult process to maintain, right? Like there's so many things to keep in mind about, oh, I don't need this, but I do need this. And then, so definitely a lot of interesting decisions. I think it's funny you mentioned 11T though, because I think if I ever have to rewrite my site, I'm
Yeah,
100% just going to go with 11T.
I think so. And
Maybe our next project.
Viable, I'm not sure what you mean. Are those like remix? I'm not sure what you mean by those. Remix is
Oh,
cool. I've gone
11T or
through.
Astro.
Oh, are those like remix? Alevity is a very purely static site generator. Remix is a server application that spits out server rendered pages. Remix does not do static exports. They rely on browser and cache control to essentially cache things. So they say you don't need static exports. Use the platform, use caching and cache control headers and things like that
Right.
to handle those situations.
You know, though, there is something of a similarity between Remix and 11T, as weird as it sounds, right? Because the people that are familiar with both of those technologies are like, those are two completely divergent, they're not even adjacent to each other, right? But you had mentioned use the platform, right? Which is kind of like the chanting mantra behind both of these tools. In the sense of like 11T is very focused on static HTML and we're just going to have HTML. We're not going to have any JavaScript involved, or at least for as little as we can, right? And then Remix is very similar. You can turn off JavaScript and go through a properly engineered Remix page and just boop, 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 submit the form and buy your whatever without any JavaScript. So
Yeah.
it's fascinating to see the web almost evolve back into itself, away from JavaScript, back towards more static sites, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, and like I was saying, I've been wanting to get more into backend. You can feel it shifting that way. And so if there
Yeah.
ever was a time to get back into backend, even though like they're almost getting presented as a front end framework, it's not. It's a node application, right? It's in disguise. You know, here's a node process that spits out HTML. You know, when you like request a route,
Right.
it is.
We've been flip-flopping between thin and fat clients since the 70s. It's one of our chatters. It's great.
Yeah.
But yeah, on that
Now,
regard, have you thought about maybe using Remix for any of your applications? Like, I feel like Remix is really well poised for larger scale, like enterprise, stuff.
they actually really kind of are, because I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to explore Next.js plus Supabase. And if I realize that doing so much on the client is going to cause me pain, although Next has their, Git server-side props where you can do that kind of stuff. If I feel like it's too much friction, I might look at something like Remix and just be like, I am running a server-side application. There's user data, I don't want to deal with any of this after the initial render.
Right, right.
I think we'll see. I have like a lot of exploration to do, and when I'm doing this kind of stuff, that's prime time when I stream on Twitch,
Oh
is
yeah.
to like just I'm trying out Supabase tonight. Watch me suck at something and give me pointers. You know, like
Right.
that's kind of the type of work I'll be doing here very soon. Trying to wrap up a couple like blog posts and making packages out of things and learnings from this Nxjs migration. And then it's time to start in earnest on some of these like SaaS ideas that I have, or like, little mini micro SaaSes that I can make.
For sure. For sure. We actually have someone coming on. Is it the week after? It's James Perkins talking about a
Oh,
roll your tweet.
James Perkins came on WebDev Weekly, a good buddy of
Yeah.
mine as well. He was my big time inspiration of like, what am I doing? Like, why am I not making something that could make me a buck or two on the side? You
Hmm.
know, I love making little open source packages and making my life easier, but like, I I always knew that web development could earn, some side income, and
Right.
I wasn't focusing on the right problems in order to make that happen. And so I had this blog post called Think Bigger, and you were a part of that blog post where you nailed it. You're like, yeah, you have this reputation for making these great small packages, and I'm like, oh, I don't want to be like that. I think I need to shift my direction. And it was a really good like wake up call of how I want to apply myself in 2022 to like reach a different outcome.
Right. Well, and I think that like these much smaller projects almost come naturally to us as engineers in the sense of like, you want to abstract as much as you can and don't repeat yourself and so on and so forth. And I think it's been interesting. Sindre Sortis, better watch out. But I think it's interesting seeing almost like a cultural conversation being started with engineers around this idea of like, hey, we don't need to abstract every tiny thing, right? Like we can do a good job at balancing the two. And I think zooming out is one way to do that, both in code and even in priorities, right? Like lately I've been spending a lot more time with family just because that's been a priority of mine lately, right? So I think it's super exciting that you're starting some endeavors on some SaaSes. I can't wait to see what you've got down the pipeline. Do you want to maybe like leak us a little bit of like what's on the docket?
I'll tell you the two initial ideas that I have, and they're
Yes.
literally solving my own problems. This is like the same thing as my tiny little open source packages that fix my problems. Just like, I could maybe charge $1 or two a month for them, but it
Hmm.
solves a
Hmm.
problem for me. Anyways, okay, so here's my two ideas. And I think earlier you were going to ask a question about how do I come up with these ideas. I'm I'm just starting this process of like write down everything that comes to mind,
Hmm.
as good or bad as it is. Keep a note, stuff it in there, and then you know look at it later. Anyways, the two ideas that I have. Number one, I want a way to like when I make a YouTube video or a blog post or anything, I need a way to share it to like 18 different places
Hmm.
without
Hmm.
like retyping the same thing over and over again. So essentially this is going to be like a portal where you can enter your Twitter information, your Facebook information, your Discord information, and choose where this gets shared to. What
Right.
channels, what things like that. And so that way you type it once, you press go, and you've shared the piece of content you just made.
Nice. Nice.
The other one is I actually heard Chris Coyer and Dave Rupert talk about this on Shop Talk Show, and it was an idea in my head for a while. But as soon as they said it, I was like, well, I should make it. A way to use the webcam API in a browser to capture like thumbnails essentially for YouTube videos
Oh,
or for
okay.
blog posts or whatnot. So it's like you maybe upload an HTML template or something,
Hmm.
and all you're doing is like it's putting the webcam in the frame, so you just kind of position yourself
Yeah.
right, and then snap it, and then boom, it spits out a picture for you.
Very cool.
I gotta say, just recently in the past two or three videos on my YouTube channel, I have been doing those really like gaudy thumbnails, and I'm
Circle.
I'm really torn about how I feel about that. I feel weird every time, but
Right. Right.
maybe chat can tell me how cheesy it looks. But I don't
All
know.
right, let me see.
It's like pretty clear that they do get more views, I think. But I just got to keep watching analytics for it. But yeah, I feel a little childish every time.
Someone said like Vistaprint, but for social media templates. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
You got to get a
Second one is a
tagline in
great
there.
idea. Okay. I like viable. Thank you.
Yes, yes. Is Apollo client URQL with WebSockets updates on the table? Like, is that something you might be thinking about?
Is Apollo client Urkel with WebSocket updates on the table? In regards to what?
Right. Like, are we talking about what Brad might be working on for his projects, or just in general, like something to discuss on? Imagine your SaaS is open in two tabs. Will one update the other? Oh, like for this. WebSockets is a tricky engineering challenge. Like so GraphQL can help solve that problem, right? Keeping a table up to date, right?
Subscriptions, yeah.
They are definitely tricky. Adding any type of like live interactivity goes. I don't want to say goes against the grain, but it goes against more traditional push pull methodologies, right? So like as a result, I feel like you tend to have to build out a lot more of your own logic, a lot more of your own magic, if you will.
And like we were talking about with remix versus Nextjs plus Supabase. Supabase has real time too, so like it does solve that problem for you. It solves auth for you as well. It solves security for you as well. Like that's one of the reasons why I'm leaning so much towards Supabase. Oh, it has blob storage too, so like it's giving me the backend I need without me having to go run to AWS and try to figure out all that stuff out.
Right, right.
And like I am trying to bootstrap the crap out of these. Like I'm not necessarily trying to like engineer the perfect thing. Like that'll come later. Like I'm kind of trying to like stamp out a spot in the market, get a couple people interested, and then improve over time, And
Oh
my
yeah.
goal is to do 2 SaaS products this year. If I make it to more,
Lofty
great.
goal.
Lofty
Right.
goal. They're supposed to be very simple, right? I'm not trying to go crazy,
Fair enough.
but the way I see it is like you're only you need to try out different ideas to see what's going to stick, and also like you have to just practice. And so to
Right, right.
practice making SaaS means like putting things out there. So have to start small, have to try different things, and eventually that'll like lead me somewhere, hopefully.
Knowing you, there is only brightness in your future. So
Thank
I
you.
can't wait to see what's next. All right, gang. Well, we are coming up on the hour. That is the time that we had originally scheduled. We do have a live stream coming up in 2 weeks. That's James Perkins going to be start talking about roll your tweet and Tina CMS, and yeah. All right, gang. Well, I appreciate you all, and I hope you all have enjoyed this. And Brad, again, thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, dude, thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun. We feel like we can just go and talk forever. This was great.
Always, always. It's a good time. All right, gang. I will catch you later. Bye.